Natasha Kirchuk, and this is I-24 News. Thank you for joining us. Well, the focus is on the north of Israel and the ongoing fighting with Hezbollah. The IDF has killed more than 400 Hezbollah operatives since the ground operation in southern Lebanon began this week. And as troops are dismantling Hezbollah infrastructure on the border, fighter jets are still striking at the terror group's stronghold in Beirut, eliminating key leaders there, as well as Nasrallah's supposed successor, who was targeted yesterday. Now, Hezbollah at this point says that they have lost contact with him, and our correspondent Nicole Tzedek has the latest developments.
The Iron Dome has been hard at work in northern Israel as Hezbollah continues to expand its firing range towards Haifa and the surrounding area. But the IDF is weakening this threat as the ground operation in southern Lebanon continues. More than 400 Hezbollah operatives have been killed in the past week, some of them hiding out in a command center embedded in a mosque next to the Salah Gandor Hospital in southern Lebanon. Another example of the terror group strategically using civilian infrastructure. Israeli troops also demolished several Hezbollah tunnel shafts used to approach the Israeli border and hide weapons. 9 Israeli soldiers have been killed during battles in Lebanon so far, as well as 2 killed in a drone attack on the Golan Heights from an Iran-backed Iraqi militia that injured 24 other soldiers as well.
I would like to send my condolences from the bottom of my heart to the families of our heroes who fell today in Lebanon. God bless their blood. May their memory be blessed. We are in the middle of a tough war against Iran's axis of evil, which seeks to destroy us. This will not happen because we will stand together, and with God's help, we will win together.
Deeper in Lebanon, Israel's airstrikes continue, allegedly going after Hassan Nasrallah's presumed successor, Hashem Safiaddin, less than 1 week after the Hezbollah leader was killed, and now it's unclear if his predecessor is still alive. Israel is clearly working to dismantle Hezbollah from its leaders to its arms. Fighter jets struck a 2-mile-long tunnel from Syria to Lebanon used to smuggle Iranian weapons, according to the IDF. But it also happens to be the busiest border crossing between the two countries, especially now, as an estimated 300,000 people have fled to Syria over the past 10 days amid the Israeli attacks in Lebanon that have no signs of slowing down.
Well, joining us now from the north of Israel is our correspondent, Zach Anders. Zach, where are you right now, and what is the latest? How much rocket fire have we seen today, and how does it compare to the past few days?
A considerable amount this morning and through the afternoon hours. We've had multiple attacks into the Haifa metro area. We did get initial reports of injuries. The ambulance service says those injuries are actually not physical wounds, that 10 were taken to nearby medical centers as a precaution, and the ambulance service here saying that was for anxiety. In several hits that occurred throughout the morning attacks, we have also been watching as fires have been addressed by some of the fire crews up here in several locations throughout the north caused by these raining rockets and debris from the interceptions. On the other side, in southern Lebanon, we continue to see smoke rising from several locations just across the border and from what appears to be continued artillery hits in these areas. Now, from what we're hearing about this ground invasion into Lebanon, it continues to grow in scope and scale. And right now, the IDF is quietly optimistic about where this is going with the level of ground forces that have already entered into Lebanon, hearing reports of resistance in areas, but not as strong as we might have expected. And from what I've been told and from what we're interpreting here by some of the information that we're getting in the north, that Hezbollah has moved some of its more elite forces on the ground a bit deeper inside Lebanese territory, away from these border towns and villages that they're not engaging necessarily right on the border like they were within the last 48 hours, but that Hezbollah reportedly, or at least from what we can gather, has moved in a considerable fashion, a bit deeper inside Lebanese territory. Now, I want to stress that a lot of this is now operating under military censorship, so a lot of the details that we are allowed to report have to get approved ahead of time. That is the stage of the conflict that we have entered into. But from what we can share, it does appear that Hezbollah resistance is there, but it is deeper inside Lebanese territory than one might have expected, that some of these border towns and areas are not necessarily seeing immediate resistance with ground forces from Hezbollah. Rather, they're encountering intricate networks of defenses, roadside explosives, explosives planted in buildings, things of that nature, that Hezbollah does have defenses in these areas, but their ground forces appear to be, based on some of the available intelligence, do appear to be deeper inside the country right now, waiting for the IDF to push even farther north right now. But really, that's all we have that we can share. Again, as we do see engagement, though, taking place in several areas, and this continued outgoing artillery that is targeting some of these areas within 2-3 miles of the border itself. So I'm expecting that later tonight we will see some considerable updates concerning the operations on the ground in southern Lebanon. But for right now, we're being advised to hold off until something significant takes place later tonight.
Quick question here. Do we have any new guidelines from the Home Front Command as to what Israeli citizens need to be doing, not only in the north, but also in the center of the country to keep themselves safe?
That is a great question, because I did not check the Home Front Command this afternoon. I would imagine, you know what, I'll check that and I'll get back to you. How about that?
All right, perfect. I'm sure you can do that quickly, and we'll have an update for everybody shortly. I'd like to turn now to our guests in the studio. Zach Anders, thank you for joining us. We have military and strategic affairs analyst Yaakov Lapin joining us, and of course our correspondent Nicole Tzedek. So, Yaakov, at this point, following almost 2 weeks of escalating fighting against Hezbollah, how strong is the terror group out of Lebanon?
I think it's nowhere near as strong as it was a month ago and even 2 weeks ago. A month ago, Hezbollah was still a terror army. In other words, it had a significant ability to rain down fire from the air on all over Israel. It had the ability to launch cross-border raids by death squads. Those capabilities have been severely degraded. As of now, the ground maneuver that the IDF has launched has taken away already most of Hezbollah's ability to launch even limited cross-border raids. And in terms of the air attacks, the rockets and the missiles that Hezbollah had planned for Israel at this stage of the war, I think this is actually, in many ways, the biggest story so far. We have been told, according to assessments that date back before this period, this stage of the war, that Hezbollah could have rained down thousands of rockets on central and northern Israel every single day. We're not seeing that. That capability has been severely degraded. The top three echelons of Hezbollah's command have been completely removed from the face of the earth, and tens of thousands of its rockets and missiles have been destroyed. So Hezbollah, I think, is in a state of shock. A lot of its command and control has collapsed. It is still able to fire what it is firing, which is about, a couple of hundred projectiles a day at northern Israel. This is not what the Iranians or what Hezbollah had planned. And I think we're seeing a collapse of the Iranian strategy here of having Hezbollah as this great sort of force that can rain down mass fire on Israel. That is not materializing, and that's a huge development in this war.
Right. I mean, you're essentially saying that it is a result of Israel's ongoing targeting of Hezbollah, that they're not able to fire these rockets. But, we have had analysts come on here who say, actually, hold your horses. All this celebrating that we've been seeing from the Israeli public as to Nasrallah, for example, having been taken out, needs to be reined in, because this could also be a strategic move on the part of the terror organization. Perhaps they do have the ability to continue to launch these rockets, but are choosing not to strategically.
I don't buy it. I don't think that's the case. I think that this stage of the war is so advanced, if they're not going to unleash their firepower, after Hassan Nasrallah is taken out in Dakhya, after the Israeli Air Force is bombing Dakhya as if it's Gaza, and with that level of frequency and precision, and now, there are just to remind viewers, a month ago when we heard about an airstrike in Dakhla, everybody would look for their local shelters. Everybody would assume, that all hell is going to break loose. Now we're used to a reality in which the Air Force is bombing Hezbollah targets in Dakhla, in the heart of Beirut, every single day, multiple times a day. This is not because Hezbollah is waiting on something. I think it's because they are not capable of expressing their capabilities, because most of those capabilities have been taken offline. They do have thousands of rockets left. They have tens of thousands of terrorists that are still able to fight in southern Lebanon. I'm not saying that they've been removed completely. I'm saying that they're a shadow of their former self.
Right. Okay, we're going to continue this discussion a little bit later on. I'd like to turn to our next guest. As the fighting continues to escalate between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Israeli military is in the midst of planning a response to Iran's attack on the country, which we saw on Tuesday night. That was an absolute insane display of rocket fire. 200 ballistic missiles fired into Israeli territory. Citizens could see this in skies across the state of Israel. The IDF is warning that the response is going to be serious and significant. And according to a report out of the New York Times, a growing number of Iranians are now expressing anxiety over the potential war that could ensue, saying that the Islamic Republic has not built proper defensive measures to protect the public, like basic bomb shelters. Well, joining us now is contributing writer at The Atlantic, Arash Azizi. So first of all, give us a sense of where the Iranian public stands when it comes to this war. There are many who say they don't want a war with Israel. They don't support the Islamic Republic of Iran. On the other hand, could we expect most Iranians to rally around the Iranian flag if a larger war does break out with Israel attacking Iran proper?
I think most Iranians definitely don't want a war with Israel. Our society does not really have an animus toward Israel, generally speaking. You don't find the sort of classical anti-Israel feelings that exist in many Arab countries in Iran, and they don't want to get their country into the war. So I think most of the population is really exhausted by the regime's repression, but also very worried about the possibility of war. And if I'm honest with you, I think this is very short-sighted, but there is a minority of the population who actually looks favorably of the possibility of Israeli strikes, because they see it as sort of a weakening of the Islamic Republic. Again, I personally don't share that view, and I think it's a short-sighted view, but there are those who think that. But unfortunately, as I said, Iranian economy has really been weakened in recent years. People have been really repressed by their own regime. So not a possibility of a war, of their regime getting themselves into a war with the country. We don't have any natural disputes. We don't have a border with Israel. We don't have any reason, as Iran as a country has no reason to be fighting Israel. And so I think a lot of people are really angry at the regime for putting them at the risk of this war that won't be good news.
What kind of attack do you think that Iran is expecting at this point, and what impact would that have on the country? Obviously, you mentioned the very severe economic crisis that locals are facing on the ground.
We all know, and Iranians who discuss these things know that there are 3 levels of attack sort of possible. There's a possibility of Israel attacking the military sites and nuclear sites. And then there's a possibility of infrastructure, i.e. refineries, sites like that could have a really severe effect on Iran. It could push Iran back basically for a decade at least, if not more. And the third is sort of a political, the possibility that they actually want to go and, assassinate and kill sort of ranking sort of leaders, military leaders or such sorts. I don't think that the third one, I think we all believe that that's sort of has the least possibility. But I think a lot of Iranians that I've spoken to hope at least that it won't be that even if Israel does attack, it won't be an attack on infrastructure, which, as I said, will push Iran back and push our people back, our economy back for a very long time. But yeah, so these are some of the expectations. And what kind of attack Israel does will also determine what kind of response it gets from the Iranian people, from different political forces. You asked me earlier about the rally around the flag. It's an interesting question. I think we've already seen a bit of a regime factions, i.e. different regime factions. I would say something like, very broadly defined, maybe 15 to 20% of the Iranian society 10%, 15% of them are maybe hardcore regime supporters. The others are not necessarily regime supporters, but they're regime critics. They're not really opposed to the regime as a whole. Yes, amongst them, we've seen a bit of a rally around the flag, but that they want to defend their country against the foreign attack. But even amongst them, there is an anger and there's a belief. There are pragmatic elements, even inside the Iran regime, even inside the Iran establishment. I believe Iran has no business fighting Israel. This is this is not what was supposed to happen, and it's not what should happen. And you mentioned the shelters. Yes, there is a severe problem. When I was born in 1988, my mother, as a pregnant woman, had been in shelters hiding from Saddam Hussein's missiles, and this is the first time ever since then, in almost 40 years later, where there's a possibility that we missiles in our cities. I don't think, unfortunately, the regime has prepared defenses enough for this situation.
Right. Well, Iran has vowed an even more crushing response if Israel chooses to strike back against that ballistic missile attack that we saw on Tuesday. In your opinion, how much worse could that look, that kind of response actually look, given what we saw the Islamic Republic do on October 1st? Certainly, almost 200 ballistic missiles launched at all parts of the country is no small feat. And at this point, what kind of arsenal does the Islamic Republic have?
They have at least a few hundred more missiles of the same level, and there's a problem that they cannot produce them fast enough if they actually want to attack Israel. But I mean, it could be worse. They could try to actually attack Israeli infrastructure. The kind of threats that they've made, they're putting sort of maps around, talking about what are some of the sites they could hit. This is the oil terminals, the refineries from Ashkelon to Haifa to different parts of Israel. And what the military leaders of Iran are saying is that, Israel is a small country and it's reliant on a few different sites. So they could try to attack them. And I think the Israeli air defense is pretty good. Obviously, the Arrows system, in addition to David's Sling and Iron Dome. And they could stop a lot of them, but I think it's clear that if Iran really puts a lot of pressure there, they can't defend all of them. But the more important deterrent is that, of course, if Iran does something like that degrades Israeli capabilities, like, attacks refineries and things like that, then it could expect a much harsher attack on Iranian soil. And that should be the main deterrent. I want to be clear that I think the Iranian regime does not really want war. Now, of course, they have terrible anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views, and that's clear. But also, I don't think Ayatollah Khamenei wants war. I think he has always been afraid of a direct confrontation with Israel. I don't think he wants it now, and I think he will try to do what he can to avoid it while he's alive, and he's 85, so that's not very long. But they are, in terms of the threats that they're making, they've said very clearly which sites in Israel they want to attack if Iran gets hit. And some of there's a lot of the different proponents of different sides are doing all sorts of loud talk that's, you can't differentiate gibberish from the serious sport sometimes.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting to hear your input on this. We're going to turn back to our guests in the studio for some more discussion on this topic. It's interesting. Our guest Aziz was essentially saying that the Islamic Republic doesn't really want to see a larger war break out. We obviously know there are both political and economic reasons for this. Iran is dealing with many of its own internal issues on the ground. But the bottom line is a decision to fire almost 200 ballistic missiles, essentially indiscriminately across the state of Israel, was, for the state of Israel, a cry for war, ultimately. So the question is, what do you think Iran's, strategy is in carrying out an attack like that? Was this a show of support or defense, more specifically for Hezbollah? Or do you think that they just went over their heads and got themselves in too deep?
I think they gambled, and I think they're going to end up regretting this gamble. Essentially, Iran's strategy, the strategy of the Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC, has been to surround Israel with a ring of fire, back up that ring of fire with a nuclear program to eventually create a nuclear umbrella, and then keep Israel in an endless war of attrition until the state of Israel collapses. That has been their strategy. They are completely and utterly obsessed with the destruction of the state of Israel, have allocated endless resources to that goal at the expense of the Iranian people. Now they see their ring of fire collapsing, And this throws them off balance. And so they felt that they had to respond to the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, who was their primary flagship proxy in Lebanon. They see that the ground maneuver is going ahead. They see that Hamas is offline. Is anybody talking about what Hamas might do to central Israel? Nobody's even talking about it.
Right.
So they see that the Ring of Fire is falling apart. And I think that puts them under a lot of pressure. And they wanted to signal to what's left of their axis that Iran will pick up the pieces and will lead the way. And that puts them exactly where they never wanted to be, which is state-on-state conflict with Israel.
Right. They didn't want to get their forces involved. They wanted to use the forces of all their proxy groups to do the dirty work.
Exactly. The Iranians want to fight Israel down to the last Palestinian, down to the last Lebanese, down to the last Yemenite. Now they have opened themselves up to direct Iranian retaliation. I think this is an opportunity. I think that Israel is going to be tempted to call Iran's bluff. The nuclear program, which is now past so many red lines, I think this is going to be an attractive target. Their oil facilities, which they use to fund this entire war machine that they've built across the Middle East, these are all going to be attractive targets, and we're going to have to see in the coming days how far Israel is going to go.
All right, we're going to actually discuss that in the coming hour, but I'd like to turn to our next story. We were speaking about Hezbollah and its military capabilities at this point, but how many missiles does Hezbollah still have in its arsenal at this point in the ongoing fighting? Well, our Fabio Shapiro takes a look at Hezbollah's existing capabilities, or at least what is estimated.
Since October 8th, Hezbollah has mainly used rockets to attack northern Israel, launching an estimated 8,000. But the Iranian proxy possesses a large variety of firepower,
including long-range cruise missiles, heavyweight rocket with 1,000-kilo warhead. This is the same type of rocket that was used in the Majd al-Shams attack that killed 12 innocent children. We also struck a short and medium-range rockets and UAVs, all capable of attacking deep inside Israeli territory and causing major damage to civilian towns and cities.
The IDF and the CIA estimate that beside around 50,000 combatants, Hezbollah has an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets, capable of hitting all areas of Israel. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that the terror group has over 100,000 short and long-range rockets, over 20,000 short-range unguided ballistic missiles, over 150 short-range guided ballistic missiles, and over 10 intermediate-range unguided ballistic missiles, making its capabilities 20 to 33 times larger than Hamas's, besides having a longer range of reach. But it seems both terror groups have a similar way of storing their firepower.
In these images, you can see how Hezbollah hides long-range rockets with range of hundreds of kilometers inside the attic of a house in the heart of Khumin al-Takhta village in southern Lebanon. You can see here that the rocket is stored on an hydraulic system and is prepared for a launch out of an opening in the roof, directed at the communities in northern Israel. And more than that, under this attic, a family lives and serves as a human shield for Hezbollah.
Much of this military growth is linked to Hezbollah's main supporter and weapons supplier, Iran, which provides the group with new missile systems such as their Almas-3 anti-tank missile, but also providing guidance systems to upgrade Hezbollah's older systems. Over 60,000 Israelis await to return home. A much larger challenge can be expected on the way to southern Lebanon's Litani River.
All right, let's turn to here in Jaffa. Israelis are still reeling following one of the deadliest terror attacks in recent memory, specifically within Tel Aviv and Jaffa, just minutes away from the studio where we're filming live right now. Now, 7 people were killed and 16 others were wounded in that attack when 2 Palestinian terrorists from the West Bank city of Hebron started shooting and stabbing civilians on a light rail train in Jaffa and then got off and continued their rampage on the street. These images that you're seeing right here were actually shot by our very own I-24 News correspondents who were there on the ground at the scene. Now, this attack took just minutes before Iran's massive ballistic missile attack on Israel on Tuesday. You probably saw us basically breaking this story to you live when those sirens started sounding. And today, a funeral is being held for one of the victims, 26-year-old Yonas Krosis, a Greek citizen who was raised in Jerusalem after his parents decided to move to Israel to work as doctors. You could see him on the bottom right of your screen right now. Now, alongside Yonah, 6 others were murdered, including 24-year-old Revital Bronstein, 42-year-old Ilya Nozadze, 30-year-old dancer Shaha Goldman, 33-year-old mother Inbar Segev Vigder, who was tragically killed while protecting her 9-month-old son, and 40-year-old Nadia Sokolenchko. Of course, the state of Israel is still reeling following this attack. It happened, right as we saw the massive Iranian ballistic missile attack, which immediately the media focus kind of turned to that. And then we had the high holidays here of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. But these funerals are slowly but surely now being carried out, and really just a tragic moment for the state of Israel and these civilians and their families. All right, that is it for now. All right, we're turning back to our guests in the studio before we go out for a commercial break. We really have barely covered the fact that this massive terror attack took place on the streets here in Jaffa, just a couple minutes from where we are. What have we been hearing from the Israeli security apparatus in terms of what kind of response there's going to be to this?
So, look, this is a persistent, deadly threat that we have faced for many years, for decades, and every once in a while we get a terrible reminder of how serious this threat is. And in terms of what happened, we know that these 2 terrorists came out of the Hebron area on the same day, very likely, arrived in Israel, didn't stay anywhere locally in Jaffa, by the way, despite false claims to the contrary. And in fact, there were members of a mosque right here around the corner who called the police. As soon as he left the mosque, he went into the mosque, one of the gunmen, and threatened them to be quiet and stay in the mosque. And then as soon as he left, they called the police and issued an alert. So Palestinian murderous terrorism is the product of generations of incitement and guns. When you put these things together, what you get are hundreds of attempts every single month of these terrorists to infiltrate Israel and conduct these attacks. The Shin Bet and the IDF prevent the vast majority, I don't want to say 99%, but the vast majority. And when they get through, it's a very painful reminder of the persistent threat that we face here every single day.
Really just such a terrible incident. We're going to go out for a quick commercial break, but we'll be back shortly with continued updates. Don't go anywhere.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish World Weekly. I'm Khaled Ben-David, and each week we're going to bring you the latest from the Jewish world, from politics to religion, entertainment to the latest trends, and everything in between. Join me each week as we explore the global Jewish diaspora. Don't miss Jewish World Weekly only on I-24 News.
All right, and we are back in the studio on I-24 News. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thank you for joining us. Now, Israel has not given any assurances to the Biden administration that targeting Iran's nuclear facilities is off of the table in retaliation for Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israeli territory earlier this week. That is, according to a top U.S. State Department official who told CNN that it's, quote, really hard to tell if Israel will use the anniversary of Hamas's October 7th attacks to retaliate. Now, President Joe Biden said earlier this week that the U.S. would not support Israel targeting Iran's nuclear program. And joining us now in the studio is military and strategic affairs analyst Yaakov Lapin and our correspondent Nicole Tzedek. So, Nicole, I'd like to turn to you at this point. You know, this is something that we were speaking about a little bit earlier. What kind of response we're going to be seeing from Israel when it comes to this ballistic missile attack from Iran? On one hand, you would think the United States would say, you know, this is now an open field day, basically, for Israel to take a hit at Iran's nuclear capabilities. So why would Biden be coming out right now saying, wait a second, don't do that?
Right now, the messaging coming from the Biden administration and the White House, they want to see some sort of a quote-unquote proportional response. Now, the question is, what's a proportional response when you see nearly 200 ballistic missiles fired towards Israel? However, Israel mainly shot most of them down, along with their coalition partners, that being the United States, the UK, some other in the region as well. But only one person was killed, a Palestinian man in the West Bank. Other than that, it's mainly just material damage that was caused by some of the dozens that were still able to penetrate through the Israeli air system. Right. So right now, the messaging coming out of the United States is no one was really injured. They didn't succeed. This was a failed mission from Iran, so don't strike them back. And it comes back from them not wanting to see this escalate into the wider region as well. So that's why we're hearing the quote-unquote don't coming from Biden when it goes to targeting the nuclear facilities. But it goes further than that because he's also messaging and cautioning Israel now against targeting the oil facilities as well. And so the question is, what type of response does the United States want to see from Israel? Because the messaging still remains that they do support Israel's right to defend itself from Iran. But now that Israel's considering that retaliation and defending itself, they don't seem to want to actually see it come to fruition.
Right. Okay. So the question is, of course, is this just elections playing a role, given the fact that in less than a month from now, it's hard to believe there are going to be American elections. Kamala Harris needs to be basically doing everything she can to ensure both the Jewish and Arab vote in these upcoming elections. Or is there perhaps some reason, Yaakov, that, it's hard for us to understand as to why Biden would not want Israel to do the dirty work, essentially, and attack Iranian nuclear facilities?
I think it's simple, and I think this actually goes back, months, really since the beginning of the Gaza war. At every stage of this conflict, the Biden administration has made it very clear that it wants to de-escalate, to stop the hostilities, because their concern is that this is going to drag the U.S. into a war with Iran. And ultimately, the U.S. does not want to fight that war because the White House has decided that it is not in America's interest to get into another Middle Eastern war. We can talk about whether they're right or they're wrong. I think that this is actually not going to serve the American global interest in any way to allow Iran to grow stronger, to become a nuclear weapon state, and to link up with Russia as it is doing. This is only going to threaten global security. But either way, whatever we think of it, this is the policy and the defined self-interest of the United States. And this has been the dictating sort of factor behind all of these statements. We can trace this pattern back months. They said, don't go into Rafah. It's going to be a disaster. How are we going to evacuate 1 million Palestinians? Okay, so Israel evacuated 1 million Palestinians. Then they said, don't go into southern Lebanon. Israel went into southern Lebanon. There's a pattern here that's emerging. Israel says, thank you very much for your advice, and then continues to pursue its security interest as it sees fit. And this is a very delicate balancing act. Obviously, the United States is the most important strategic ally of the State of Israel. We can't ignore the massive amounts of ammunition that the United States provides. So it's not so easy or simple for Israel to say, thanks, but no thanks. This is, in fact, what we're seeing happening on the ground. And I expect this pattern to continue with Iran as well.
And just quickly talking about that massive amount of support we're seeing coming from the United States, even as they're messaging Israel to not have a strong response, they're still preparing for some sort of an escalation. They're sending thousands of more troops here to the region. We've seen more than a dozen warships here. We're talking about 43,000 American troops right now in the Middle East. So they're boosting those numbers. They're sending more fighter jets, more warships. They're prepared to show that material deterrence as well. And so by sending this, they're still backing Israel in a sense, but it's with their words and their actions will still encouraging Israel to not have too strong of a response.
Right. All right. Well, we're going to turn back to our guests in studio shortly. I'd like to turn to Lebanon, where the public is under duress as Israel continues to respond to ongoing rocket fire from Hezbollah. On Friday, at least 4 hospitals in southern Lebanon announced that they were suspending work because of Israeli strikes following the news that a Hezbollah-affiliated health organization said that 11 paramedics had been killed in the past 24 hours. Late that night, the Israeli army issued a statement saying that Hezbollah was using medical vehicles to transport fighters and weapons, and that the IDF would strike any vehicle it suspected of being used for military purposes. Well, on Thursday, Israel hit a medical center in central Beirut that belongs to the Hezbollah-linked Islamic Health Organization, killing 9 and wounding 14. And the IDF says that that strike was targeting specifically terror assets. But joining us now to kind of further discuss Israel's goals in these targeted airstrikes is Hezbollah in Lebanon senior fellow David Daoud from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So in recent days, international headlines have been suggesting that Israel's purposely targeting health facilities in Lebanon. Is that true? And explain to us what role Hezbollah plays in Lebanon's healthcare and also social system and what that would cause Israel to target.
Thank you for having me on. I can't imagine that Israel is deliberately targeting civilian hospitals with no other purpose than to target them. It's not, despite what's said about the IDF, it's not really within the ambit of their behavior. Hezbollah itself has a network of hospitals throughout the country, most famously Rasul al-Azam Hospital. Some of these hospitals, as we've seen in Gaza, double as military assets for the group. It's not beyond Hezbollah, as we've seen from the secondary explosions that result from the Israeli strikes in civilian areas in Lebanon, to intertwine its military assets with civilian assets. Hezbollah also has the Islamic Health organization, which is you can call it its medical arm. Now, some of these workers for the Islamic Health Committee, they will double as fighters. There have been instances, for example, over the past 11 months, where a casualty from the Islamic Health Committee will be mourned as one of its employees and also a Hezbollah fighter. So what we have to remember is that Hezbollah internally has blurred the line between those who are its fighters and those who conduct more administrative tasks. And it has externally blurred the line between itself and the Lebanese civilian environment.
David, what are we hearing from the Lebanese public at this stage? I mean, do locals feel that the IDF is targeting them or Hezbollah?
Again, I think it's very difficult to speak of a Lebanese public in a unified voice. It depends on who you're going to. I would say if there is blame, it's hard to imagine that there isn't blame on Israel, that there isn't antipathy towards Israel right now, irrespective of whether these Lebanese recognize that Hezbollah began this fight, that Hezbollah refused to back down from this fight. At the end of the day, it's Israel conducting the strikes now. And this is, aside from the question of the strikes' legality or their precision, when someone's firing at you, you tend to resent them. Now, there are Lebanese who are blaming Hezbollah. There are Lebanese who are celebrating the deaths of Hezbollah commanders. But again, I wouldn't say it's a majority of people who are anti-Hezbollah. I would say you have a very mixed bag on top of a history of antipathy towards Israel that is very common among Lebanese.
Now, UNIFIL says that it's not moving from positions in southern Lebanon near the border, despite what it said was an Israeli request to relocate. Why not adhere to Israeli requests, given the fact that UNIFIL has utterly failed to peacekeep since the 2006 ceasefire? I mean, are they trying to get hurt in the line of fire, per se?
That's a question beyond me to answer, but you are correct that UNIFIL has been entirely ineffective, and this goes to the nature of its mandate. The nature of UNIFIL's mandate is such that they are supposed to act as an auxiliary force, a support force for the Lebanese government, which is supposed to have distanced Hezbollah north of the Litani at a minimum, and then disarmed Hezbollah and prevented the entry of arms and materiel into the country without the consent of the government. Given that the Lebanese state, because of Hezbollah's integration into Lebanon's political and social fabric, Hezbollah are not from Mars, they're Lebanese. The Lebanese government hasn't acted against Hezbollah, and as an auxiliary, UNIFIL also hasn't either. It's just not in their mandate. What they're still doing there right now, that's beyond me to answer.
Now, speaking of which, the Lebanese military, where are they in all of this, and what is the Lebanese government saying as this fighting continues?
The Lebanese military, as far as I know, withdrew some kilometers north as the Israeli ground incursions began. They don't seem to be involved in the fighting, at least not directly that we know of at this point. The Lebanese government, that's a different question. The Lebanese government, since October 8th, there was a period of silence, and then they saw that they could take advantage of Hezbollah's attacks to extract concessions from Israel on land border disputes, extract concessions from the international community on financial support, on helping elect a president. And so they started to, from Prime Minister Mikati, Foreign Minister Abdullah Abu Habib, Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri, they all adopted the Hezbollah line. That a ceasefire in Gaza would have to precede a Lebanon ceasefire. And Abdullah Abu Habib, the foreign minister, made it very clear the Israelis aren't going to get a ceasefire from Lebanon for free because, quote, we don't work for the Israelis.
All right. Well, David, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, giving us your insight. We're going to be continuing our discussion about the ongoing fighting in Lebanon shortly. Israel is ramping up its assault on Hezbollah, but the question is whether or not it will be successful. Israel's first two wars in Lebanon also had the similar goal of removing terror threats to citizens in northern Israel, but clearly have not been ultimately successful. So let's go back in time and take a look at history.
Operation Peace for Galilee, also known as the First Lebanon War. The war was launched on June 6, 1982 by Israel as it invaded southern Lebanon. The goal was to put the northern Israeli communities out of harm's way from the Palestinian terror cells in Lebanon by pushing these cells 25 miles to the north. The original plan called for Israeli troops to undertake a 25-mile incursion to wipe out Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, positions in southern Lebanon. The PLO had been broadening its presence in the country since the mid-1970s, escalating cross-border attacks on civilians in northern Israel for years. Just 1 year before the First Lebanon War, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was asked about peace talks with the PLO.
That is absolutely detrimental to the peace process because we can never negotiate with the PLO.
And so Israeli troops quickly wiped out PLO positions in the south, as well as destroyed Syrian installations in the Bekaa Valley before reaching Beirut just 3 days after the war began. The war lasted just over 3 months, culminating with the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon. But Israel's defeat of the PLO left a power vacuum in South Lebanon that was soon filled by the Iranian proxy Hezbollah, the terror organization that steadily rose to power and entrenched itself into Lebanon's government. On July 12, 2006 at 9 a.m., Hezbollah began launching rockets and mortars at IDF positions in civilian towns in northern Israel. But this attack was only a diversion. At the same time, a group of terrorists infiltrated Israel and ambushed IDF soldiers who responded to the scene. 3 soldiers were killed and 2 kidnapped into Lebanese territory. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah expected that the abduction would open negotiations for a prisoner swap, but he underestimated Israel's response.
We entered the 12th day of the operation in Lebanon, Operation Change of Direction, that the mission of the Israeli Defense Forces and of the Northern Command is to enter Lebanon to destroy as much as possible Hezbollah infrastructure, to bring to situation that the Hezbollah will disarm, that the Lebanese government will assume responsibility and sovereignty over the south of Lebanon.
Israel launched a massive air operation, flattening Hezbollah headquarters and rocket stockpiles, as well as the Beirut airport, roads, and bridges to prevent the abducted soldiers being taken out of the country. The war came to an end 1 month later. Israel, Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government accepted the conditions of the UN Resolution 1701, a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, the implementation of UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, the disarmament of Hezbollah, and keeping the militia's presence north of the Litani River. 2 years later, in July 2008, UN-brokered negotiations saw the return of the bodies of the abducted IDF soldiers to Israel. Meanwhile, in the years since UN Resolution 1701, Hezbollah remained a threat to Israel and refused to retreat north of the Litani River. On October 8, 2023, Hezbollah began firing near daily rockets on northern Israel, one day after the start of the Israel-Hamas war in the south. After months of rising tensions and constant cross-border attacks, Israel began large-scale strikes against Hezbollah positions in Lebanon and killed its leader Hassan Nasrallah.
To our enemies, I say, we are strong and determined. To our partners, I would say, our war is your war. And to the people of Lebanon, I say, our war is not with you.
Now the IDF has begun small-scale raids into southern Lebanon as a new phase in Israel's fight against Hezbollah begins.
Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has called for an arms embargo on Israel, specifically in weapons being sent to Israel for use in Gaza. This comes as the IDF is shifting its focus away from Gaza and towards Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Islamic Republic of Iran as the conflict escalates. So joining us now to discuss why this is happening now is Avi Pazner, the former Israeli ambassador to France and Italy. Avi, why is France calling for an end to weapons being shipped for use specifically in Gaza when Israel's main military focus right now is clearly with Hezbollah in the north?
I think that Macron just wanted to make a show of what the French policy towards Israel is. And I am amazed that Macron, who was known once for his friendship towards Israel, is now showing more and more signs, I would say, of weakness under the pressure of the Muslim and Arabs in his country, who number between, nobody knows exactly because you cannot do that in France, but they are between 8 and 10% today of the French population. They weigh heavily on the French political scene. Macron just made a mistake a few months ago when he dissolved parliament and afterwards had election where he lost majority. So it is a very weakened French president who wants to show, I believe, to his Muslim and Arab constituents that he takes a strong line against Israel. I want to say, in parentheses, that France does not sell arms to Israel. We have absolutely no program to buy arms in France. But of course, when the French president says a thing like that, it has reverberations all over Europe, and it can harm Israel in other countries.
Right. And obviously, this is interesting in terms of the escalation and fighting that we're seeing in Lebanon right now, given France's relationship with Lebanon. Could this perhaps be related to that?
It is possible. You know that many in France, and especially President Macron, still believe that they live in the 40s of the last century, when Lebanon was a French protectorate, and they see Lebanon as a nice Christian country, French-speaking Christian country with a majority of Christians protected by France. And I don't think that he realizes, or that many people realize today, that Lebanon is a completely different country. And there are still some sentimental ties between Lebanon and France. And it is possible that Macron, seeing our offensive in Lebanon and seeing our successes in eliminating the heads of the Hezbollah, wants to send a message to Israel, a warning to Israel, but does not speak about Lebanon, but speaks about Gaza, where, by the way, there is almost no war now. This is also something which I think it's worth underlying. So it is here the policy of a very weak French president who wants to gain favor with his Arab and with his Muslim population.
All right, Ambassador Posner, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, giving us your insight.
Thank you very much.
Just want to quickly turn to our guests in the studio for a very, very fast commentary here. Nicole, you know, what is the kind of outpouring of commentary that we're hearing from the international community when it comes to the ongoing escalation and fighting that we're seeing in the region?
In the region, the timing of this, it might seem a little bit strange calling for an arms embargo in Gaza, but it does come as the attention is coming back to Israel and seeing how they use their weapons across the region, and specifically as the fighting does ramp up in Lebanon. So this is also similar to what we saw a little more than a week ago from the United States, Senator Bernie Sanders calling for a block on sales of some $20 billion of weapons sales to Israel. Now, something like that in the United States will not pass, likely, but it does fall in line with the other calls for an arms embargo like this to come towards Israel. And so as we see Israel continuing its military efforts to defend its borders, unfortunately, on the flip side, you will likely see some of these other countries in the international community ramp up their calls to stop selling these weapons to Israel so they can defend themselves.
Right. All right. We are going to turn right now to the hostages. Israelis and Jews around the world have just celebrated the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah, but it's certainly been a more somber holiday given the fact that 101 Israeli hostages still remain in captivity in the Gaza Strip. Now, their families are growing more and more desperate as international headlines have now shifted the focus to the escalating fighting between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran, and as negotiations for a hostage release and ceasefire deal remain at a standstill. Well, joining us now in Tel Aviv is our correspondent, Joe Brown. Joe, where do negotiations for a ceasefire deal stand at this point? What is the latest out of the Gaza Strip?
Well, later today, the Security Cabinet will convene in the building behind me, the Kiryat, the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. And most of the focus, as has been in the headlines over the last couple of days, will be the ground incursion into Lebanon and also how to respond best to Iran following the ballistic missile attack on Tuesday. However, the fighting in the Gaza Strip and the hostage deal seems to be on the back burner for the time being. The Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, has cancelled a couple of meetings with the hostages' families over the last week, as he's wanted to focus more on the north and the existential threat from Iran. And Benjamin Netanyahu has similarly not spoken to the hostage families during this time. And it doesn't seem to be just Israel who isn't focusing as much on the hostages and the hostage deal right now. The Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, has reportedly been very unwilling to engage in talks over the last couple of weeks because he is seeing what's happening all around him. All of his allies are getting assassinated, including over the holidays. It was announced that the de facto prime minister in Gaza was killed in an IDF strike 3 months ago, as well as, of course, Ismail Haniyeh at the end of July. And he has noticed a shift in this, and he has decided to play it out for as long as possible. He is hoping that with the escalations going on with Iran and with Lebanon, he is able to worm his way into getting a deal that encompasses all, a total ceasefire within the region. And that means that Israel will stop fighting in Gaza, and that means that he can potentially keep the hostages as leverage. There's still 101 hostages in the Gaza Strip. It's approaching 1 year since October the 7th, and people are still hopeful for a deal, but at the moment, it doesn't seem to be progressing at any time soon.
All right, that's Joe Brown joining us from Tel Aviv with that update. We're going to be back with you shortly again. I'd like to just turn back to our guest in the studio for a final comment here. Yaakov, obviously, you just heard what Joe had to say. The focus is no longer on the Gaza Strip and on the plight of these hostages. Is there anything that could change that?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think that Israel is going to have to start proceeding with its plans for Gaza. And as a byproduct, those plans might place the additional pressure on whatever is left of Hamas's leadership to maybe show more flexibility than they're showing right now. Even according to American assessments, Sinwar is the main stumbling block right now to any deal. If Israel starts talking about setting up, for example, a temporary military administration, a basic one, that would put a lot of pressure, I think, on Hamas. And, that's not even a military step, although it would, of course, have military dimensions to it. So I think the more Israel shows that it's going to stay in this for the long run and ensure the regime change of Hamas, that will act as a pressure lever on Hamas and maybe try and get Hamas to try and freeze that process, and that could open things up for a kind of a deal going forward. I don't know if we have time to also address what we heard before about an arms embargo in Europe, but I just wanted to say that this arms trade, so-called arms trade, is a two-way street, and Israel is actually enabling European countries like Germany to be, to supply themselves with air defense systems against Russia. It's helping Britain train its armored corps. Right. The Israeli military industrial complex is critical for European security, and so look out for those who are not calling for an arms embargo because they're actually dependent on Israeli technology. Very interesting.
Nicole, I just want to talk to you about the situation with the hostages. Obviously, tonight we are seeing the mass protests calling for a deal. Not postponed fully, but we know that there's not going to be as many people taking to the streets just because of Home Front Command guidelines and obviously the general situation. What are we hearing in terms of the Israeli public and its response to the fact that there's kind of limited international conversation at this point about these hostages?
Especially the timing of this. Tonight is Saturday. We see these weekly demonstrations every Saturday, and this Saturday marks 1 year since the dark Saturday when those 101 hostages that are still there were kidnapped. So clearly the families right now would want to see this massive show of support with everyone in the streets calling for their loved ones to return home. But due to the situation unfolding, they're not seeing this situation unfold exactly how they would want. But we're still hearing them push for that to continue to get it in not only the Israeli public's attention, but the international attention as well.
All right, we're going to go out for a quick commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back shortly. Our guests will still be here with us in the studio for continued updates about the latest in the ongoing escalation of fighting between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran and its proxies in the region. I'm Natasha Kirchak. This is I-24 News. See you soon.
Sail for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayazad.fr.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
And we are back on I-24 News. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for sticking with us. Well, the Iranian attack on Israel on Tuesday has left the Middle East on edge. Israel's vowed revenge after Iran sent over 180 ballistic missiles into Israeli territory, but has also said that it will take its time in choosing how and when. Arlene Plachmeyer has the latest.
In the wake of Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel on Tuesday, the Middle East is on high alert for a potential escalation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the public after the attack, vowing revenge.
Iran made a big mistake tonight, and it will pay for it. The regime in Iran does not understand our determination to defend ourselves and our determination to retaliate against our enemies.
Israel's ally, the United States, is weighing in on the matter of a potential response. President Joe Biden has remained steadfast in his commitment to avoid a wider war in the Middle East and cautioned Israel against a disproportional response.
The Israelis have not concluded what they're going to do in terms of a strike. That's under discussion. I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be thinking about other alternatives than striking oil fields.
Republican candidate Donald Trump, on the other hand, completely disagreed, backing a harsher response during a campaign event in North Carolina on Friday.
We have to be totally prepared. We have to be absolutely prepared. But when they asked him that question, the answer should have been hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later.
In a rare speech, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei commented on the Iranian attack on Tuesday, in which the Islamic Republic fired over 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, saying that the unprecedented barrage was justified and threatened to do it again.
What military and political decision makers deem logical, wise, and right will be done in due time. It was done recently, and in future, it will be done again if necessary.
Following the Iranian attack, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi visited Beirut in support of Hezbollah and the Lebanese people. Despite Iran's aggression against Israel, the foreign minister spoke out in favor of a ceasefire.
With regards to a ceasefire, I have spoken to Lebanese officials, and we are in touch with other countries with the aim of establishing a ceasefire. We support efforts towards a ceasefire on the condition, firstly, the preservation of the rights of the Lebanese people, and it is accepted by the resistance, and thirdly, is simultaneous with a ceasefire in Gaza.
On Saturday, Araghchi arrived in Damascus for talks with Syrian officials. Since the beginning of the war, Israel has been increasing its attacks on the bordering country, targeting weapons facilities and IRGC officials. And so, with the long arm of Iran extending throughout the Middle East, the war with Israel's multi-headed enemy seems to be far from over.
Joining us now from the north of Israel is our correspondent, and if we've seen any more rocket fire within the past hour.
We noted 2 interceptions overhead here in Kiryat Shmona along this border with Lebanon. What we've been working to put together is a full damage assessment from today's earlier attacks. The IDF tells me 115 rockets were fired at this point in the day, approximately 115. Considerable strikes into some of these areas. We see damage to homes and into the street from what appears to be falling debris and a rocket that slipped through and fell into fields in several areas. They've sparked multiple fires that I know fire crews are still actively engaged with at the moment. Remarkably, no casualties reported today. Still, MATA, the ambulance service here, saying that they did treat people on scene, some taken to nearby medical centers for anxiety from the rocket impacts near them, but no physical injuries from the shrapnel. As many as 10 treated for anxiety, the ambulance service says. Now, the chief of the IDF Northern Command, Major General Ori Gordon, here in the north today, speaking to troops, saying, quote, "When we stand, we can look towards the frontier communities. Our ground operation here is a significant step towards returning the residents of the north safely to their homes, towards a better year than the previous one." As Gordon was speaking again to troops here in the north, as we see them continue to stage here, as the amount of troops and tanks, heavy equipment that we see just continues to grow and increase here, along with the air activity, more helicopters in the air, more fighter planes overhead, a considerable amount of resources being poured here along this border, not just in our location, Kiryat Shmona, this entire border, especially in up on elevation in the more mountainous terrain, is certainly seeing a considerable amount of troops in the area and tanks. But of course, we're now in a different stage of this conflict, operating under military censorship. With a lot of these details. Still, as we hear the IDF continue to describe this as limited raid-like operations, I want to stress that what is being staged here still appears to be a large-scale invasion of Lebanon.
All right, Zach, any new Home Front Command guidelines? I know that you've since checked in on that.
I have since checked. I did check. I did my homework this time. The Home Front Commands, the current Home Front Commands, are set to expire tonight at 8 o'clock when we'll expect an update. But it has remained the same since October 2nd for, of course, folks here that are in this area, in Kiryat Shmona, anywhere along the border, continued advising for no outdoor services beyond 50 people. That's actually quite remarkable, considering for a lot of the year we've been under no outdoor gatherings whatsoever. But since this operation is kicked off, now folks, even up here along the border, are allowed to gather. You'd have to consider, too, maybe something that plays into that is the fact that if there's soldiers gathering in that side, 50 plus out in the open, then the public allowed to do the same. But essentially no changes to the Home Front Command since October 7th. We're expecting a new Home Front Command guideline to be refreshed tonight at 8 p.m. in about 2 hours.
All right. Thank you so much for that update, Zach. We're going to be back with you shortly. We're going to turn now to our guests in the studio. Joining us now is Sherry Fine-Grossman. She's a former head of regional affairs at the Israel National Security Council. We have our military and strategic affairs analyst, Yaakov Lapin, still with us, and our correspondent, Nicole Tzedek, in the studio. All right, so what we have not really discussed is the IDF ground invasion. I think the big question on many people's minds here in Israel especially is whether or not this was a necessary move on Israel's part. We have seen, what appears to be massive success in the IDF and the IAF in terms of targeting Hezbollah targets via the air, via these airstrikes, taking out major Hezbollah targets like Nasrallah. So why is it essential for Israel to put boots on the ground in the south of the country?
So in the same way that Israel has been able to get 50,000 out of the 64,000 residents of the western Negev back to their homes because the threat of a genocidal cross-border invasion, October 7th, has been removed from the south, the same thing has to happen in the north. And in fact, this whole idea of an invasion and going on killing and kidnapping spree was Hezbollah's idea originally, which Hamas copied. And so the Radwan unit, this elite unit that Hezbollah spent years building, sending into Syria for combat experience, this was the unit that was supposed to spearhead the Galilee invasion plan. And they were aligned all across the border in dozens of villages. They had an astonishing amount of weapons ready for this job of crossing the border, mass murdering Israeli civilians, killing and kidnapping others and bringing them back to Lebanon. Just what we saw on October 7th could have happened in the north. There's no way to uproot this threat except through a ground maneuver. I think the only question on my mind right now is why is there not being more extensive air power being used against these villages, which are now empty of civilians. There are no Lebanese civilians in these villages. They are purely a military terrorist base set up by Hezbollah. It seems that Israel is very heavily relying on its special forces. Perhaps part of this is due to U.S. pressure to keep this at least at this stage, as targeted as possible. But in any case, the IDF has had incredible achievements already. It's killed around 500 Hezbollah terrorists, uprooted this infrastructure, and the security situation is getting steadily better for residents of the north. Hopefully they'll be able to start coming back.
I mean, Israel says that its ultimate goal is to push Hezbollah back from the border and to return its citizens to the north, as you've indicated in what you just said. We know that in the past, diplomacy has failed to do this. UNIFIL has failed to peacekeep as it's supposed to do on the border. We know that the ceasefire in 2006, Resolution 1701, was wholly ignored by Hezbollah. So what is it going to actually take to make this happen at this point?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, this decision to go in, I don't think it was taken lightly. 11 months, they were waiting for maybe diplomacy to do its part, and that's a very important point to keep in mind. And I think that point gained Israel a lot of legitimacy with the administration about having no other alternative but this escalation in the north. It's not going to be an easy solution. I mean, even if we massively defeat or hurt the capabilities of Hezbollah, the question and the challenge will always be the day after. There's the day after in Lebanon as well. It doesn't seem any more promising than the Gaza Strip, although it's a different thing. It's a different political question. We need very good mechanisms. I don't think there is right now an answer, but the Israeli military having presence there for the foreseeable future, since I don't believe any country in the world, and this has been proven, would put its own countrymen, its own soldiers at risk in the sake of defending Israel. And we saw that in UNIFIL and peacekeeping forces that have failed all over the world. They're not doing any peace. They're just keeping quiet while the enemy is arming up.
I mean, of course, we can't ignore that politics do play a role in everything that's happening here. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has seen a loss in major support from the public following October 7th. All of a sudden, with these attacks that we saw in Hezbollah that were deemed largely successful, not only by the Israeli public but also the international community in taking out Hezbollah, he's seen perhaps a surge in more support from his own voter base. The question is it in Netanyahu's interest to essentially pull out this war with Lebanon as long as possible?
Look, I served for 11 years on the National Security Council. I saw Netanyahu that doesn't want any escalation, doesn't want more, right. Even when we tell them that he must start wars to have a better security. This is one of the, I guess, the most criticism we have from the apparatus of the security political apparatus, is that you don't take the initiative. You're always on the defensive. You're always on the conservative side. That's his real nature. So I don't think he's going in for the politics. He's going in that. Trying to get people back to their homes.
Right, but it did take him a year to do that.
And I think that has many different reasons, and I think the main one is pressure by the U.S. administration and trying to get to a deal in the South, which everybody's failed to do so.
Very, very, very quick comment here because we have to move on.
Quick as possible. I think the timing of this, a lot of it was due to military resources freeing up from Gaza and being able to be moved north. And the last thing I will say about the situation in Lebanon is that UNIFIL, in its reports, all of the weapons that are being found now, none of them made their way into a single UNIFIL report. So we were talking about what their mandate is. Their mandate was at least to report what Hezbollah was doing. It's Israel now that's implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1701 because nobody else, and certainly not UNIFIL, were able to do it.
All right, we're going to turn now to the United States. On this note, Israel has not given any assurances to the Biden administration that targeting Iran's nuclear facilities is off of the table in retaliation for Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israeli territory earlier this week. That is according to a top U.S. State Department official who told CNN that it is, quote, really hard to tell if Israel will use the anniversary of Hamas's October 7th attacks to retaliate. Well, President Joe Biden said earlier this week that the U.S. would not support Israel targeting Iran's nuclear program. And joining us now is Gabriel Noronha. He's the former special advisor for Iran at the State Department under Secretary Pompeo. So my first question for you is, why is Biden so against Israel targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, given that the U.S. does not want Iran to develop a nuclear weapon?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, it's this perennial thing that we have in this White House where it's the fear of escalation. Escalation is a very dirty word in their view, and it's a lot more important to avoid escalation than to achieve victory, is sort of the view of this White House, especially as they're getting close to an election where they want the Middle East to be as quiet as possible in order for the preferred candidate to win. Again, it's a question, I think, of how and when Israel does that strike against Iran's nuclear program. I think there's an understanding that at some point that will have to happen, but this administration always wants to push it down the road as far as possible.
Now, you know, that, of course, brings me to my next question. We are seeing American elections quickly approaching. How would Trump policy differ from Harris policy on this very issue?
Well, I think the Trump approach is Israel can and should do whatever Israel wants to do and believes that it is in its national interest to do. And so I think you would see two things. One, you would not see stories in CNN saying that Israel has said something to U.S. officials. There won't be these constant leaks. And I think the U.S. side gets very frustrated when Israel doesn't share military information, but then every time Israel does share anything, it's up in the U.S. press a few hours later, which is exactly why the Israelis don't share this intelligence with the U.S. I think that you have much stronger trust relationships in a Trump administration, so you won't see this info leakage. And ultimately, President Trump wants, I think, the Iranian nuclear program to be gone in short order, not in 10 years, but I think in the next year.
Well, what does the U.S. want to see happen with the ongoing fighting here? I mean, shouldn't Iran's attack be a sort of opening, per se, to allowing Israel to carry out much of what the West and the U.S. itself would want when it comes to dealing with the Islamic Republic?
It certainly does. You know, a proportional response would be 180 Israeli ballistic missiles going into Tehran, which would completely obliterate their entire oil infrastructure, their ballistic missile supply chain, and their nuclear program. So I think the word proportionate has been abused quite a bit lately. But I think there's again the question of one salvo versus multiple salvos. I think even Israel understands that Iran may wish to respond to their counterattack and is probably, in my view, going to leave room for a second response that could be even more overwhelming should Iran try to tempt fate and attack Israeli territory from Iranian territory again.
Now, the U.S. CENTCOM chief is expected in Israel within the next 24 hours. He you know, I mean, I guess the question is whether or not he's expected to coordinate Israel's attack on Iran, if we're going to be seeing Israel deferring to the U.S. in any sense or not.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great thing that the CENTCOM chief is going into Israel. Should be very coordinated there because, look, you have, after an Israeli response, you're going to have all U.S. bases in the region be on edge. Ideally, we will have a good notice of what's happening because our assets are either going to be involved in an intelligence capacity from a security perspective, and the blowback is likely going to come not on Israel, but on the U.S. and perhaps Arab countries. Iran is already telegraphing that it's going to punish UAE and Saudi for an attack on its oil infrastructure, and that they'll hit U.S. troops in the region if they get hit. That's all because I think Iran realizes it does not have escalation dominance against Israel, and so it figures the best way it can protect itself is to lash out at others and hope that the other countries pressure Israel in response.
Right. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting to hear what you have to say on the matter. We're going to turn to our our guests who are joining us in the studio for further discussion on how the American elections are perhaps impacting the escalation and fighting that we're seeing here in the Middle East. As the Middle East is on the brink of a full-scale war, how will the conflict influence the U.S. election? Americans are going to be heading to the polls in less than a month, and it appears that both Trump and Harris are trying to appease both Arab and Jewish American voters in a last-minute scramble. I want to turn first to our correspondent, Nicole Tzedek. How are polls looking right now, and what kind of impact has the Middle East conflict had on votes in America?
Natasha, here in the studio, we talk a lot about the Jewish American vote, but right now I want to focus on the Arab American vote, because the Jewish American vote, according to the polls, it seems, although they're complaining about the Biden administration and how the Biden administration has handled the war in Israel, not supporting Israel enough per se, it does indicate that many of these Jewish voters will continue to vote with their party, that being Democrats. But the Arab Americans, this is where we're seeing some different figures, because statistically they might have been voting for the Biden administration, but they're also not happy with how the Biden administration has tackled the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So right now, among Arab American voters, we're seeing pretty much split, tied Trump versus Harris, with about 42% going both ways. Trump versus Harris, might I say. And it's interesting because still, according to this poll, 81% of Arab Americans, they view Gaza as an important decision in their vote, but not the most important decision. The top one is still jobs in the economy, the second one being Gaza, and the third being gun violence. And so if you're looking at Arab Americans who say 81% say that Gaza is one of the largest things, but still not the largest, I think this shows us a bigger picture of the American public as a whole, where they're looking at the Middle East and the conflict here, but still they want to see what's happening inside America, that being jobs, the economy, their own borders, and that's likely going to impact their votes more than what's happening here.
Now, Jewish Americans typically vote Democrat in the United States. Many still will. Arab Americans are more split. Many can't support Biden, like you were mentioning, after his actions during the war, according to them. And the Democratic Party seems to be more divided as a whole versus the Republican, which appears to be more united. So what is that going to mean in the coming days?
It means that especially with a lot of these Arab American voters that I mentioned, if they don't want to vote for the Democratic Party and they don't want to vote for Trump, they might vote for more third-party candidates. And that could really disfigure the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party is more united in a lot of this. But when it comes to the swing states, Pennsylvania has 126,000 Arab Americans. Michigan, 392,000 Arab Americans. We're talking about massive populations of Arab American citizens in many of these swing states that could be some of the deciding votes. And so if they can't rally behind Biden and end up not showing up to the polls at all or voting for a third-party candidate, we could see them becoming a bigger player than many people realize when it comes to this next election.
Shiri, I'd like to turn to you. I'm interested to hear, whether or not you think there will really be much of a difference in terms of American policy if Trump were to get elected. Is there going to be a dramatic difference in policy between both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on the issue of the conflict in the Middle East?
Well, in one key aspect, which is this obsession about this de-escalation premise. We have seen such a far less safer place to live for me, for my kids, for you guys in the last 4 years because of this fascination with the de-escalation process. And I think after October 7, if you still thought the same way you did before October 7, then something's wrong with how you view the world. Something should have shifted. Something should have changed, in somewhat direction, or at least question your premise. And I think, what Iran is doing right now, that is threatening UAE, Saudi, it's directing its soft spot to the oil prices of the maybe October surprise of the elections, and they're strategic. They know what they're doing, and Biden saying, I'm not allowing. I don't think we should strike the nuclear facilities. I don't know when is going to be a better timing to forge a coalition in the area, in our region against this Iranian axis.
All right, Lepin, any last comments?
I couldn't agree more with what Shiri said, and I would just add that there's a real paradox in the Biden White House's foreign policy. They keep talking about the Sunni moderate coalition, and yet they've done so many things to weaken this coalition. They've distanced themselves from the role of being the region's police officer. Now Israel, for existential reasons, is filling that role, and instead of being happy that they were able to basically outsource that role, they're criticizing Israel for doing the job that they were supposed to be part of in the first place. There's nothing that could strengthen the Sunni bloc more than having a military power roll back the entire Iranian Shiite axis, Iran itself, Hezbollah, and the militias. And I think nothing could actually make them more confident in the existence of such a coalition than military action to do that. Right now, it's only Israel that's doing that, with a few exceptions in Yemen that we've just seen. But that's the picture, the way I see it, at least as of now.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, because you're going to have to be heading out of the studio.
Yep.
Shiri and Nicole are staying with us. But we're going to turn to our next story. The U.S. has taken matters into their own hands when it comes to the Iranian-backed terror group, the Houthis. Ever since October 7th, the Houthis have started targeting ships in the Red Sea, but are currently vowing to escalate military operations against Israel, including upping drone and missile strikes into Israeli territory, including in central Israel. And Arlene Plachmeyer has the details.
The US, in cooperation with the British military, has targeted over 15 Houthi sites in Yemen on Friday, including its capital Sana'a and the Houthi stronghold in the port of Hodeidah. CENTCOM confirmed in a statement on X, saying, "These targets included Houthi offensive military capabilities. These actions were taken to protect freedom of navigation and make international waters safer and more secure for US, coalition and merchant vessels." Reports say that the Houthi headquarters in central Sana'a was one of the targets. It is said that the Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi has his underground bunker there. The strikes come as the Iran-backed Houthis threaten to escalate military operations targeting Israel.
The Yemeni armed forces salute the heroic mujahideen on the fronts of Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the fronts of Lebanon and Iraq, and affirm their continuation in carrying out military operations against the Israeli enemy until the aggression is stopped and the siege on the Gaza Strip is lifted, as well as stopping the aggression on Lebanon.
On Friday, thousands protested all throughout Yemen against the Israeli military actions in the region.
The arrogance of Zionism will not last. The people will be motivated to respond. The resistance will respond. This long struggle will end with the demise of Israel and the victory of the Palestinian people.
The Houthis have targeted more than 80 merchant vessels with missiles and drones since October 7. They have seized one vessel and sunk two in their campaign that has also killed 4 sailors. In addition to attacking ships, the Houthis have targeted Israel directly with missiles and drones, including a number of recent drone attacks targeting the center of the country. In response, Israel has targeted Yemen's port of Hodeidah twice, with the latest on September 29, making Yemen yet another active front in Israel's battle against Iranian proxies in the region.
All right, we are headed out for a quick commercial break, but do not go anywhere. We're going to be back on I-24 News shortly with continued coverage of the latest updates regarding the escalating conflict between Israel, Hezbollah, Iran, and its proxies in the region, and of course, the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Natasha Kirchuk. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back.
Beloved region was 95% heaven before that fateful day. Then, in one piercing moment, horror and darkness took over our lives. But Jewish National Fund, USA, were here with us from day one, helping us to collect our pieces together. We choose life, and we will continue, always, to choose life together.
Sale for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayasad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
יש לנו משימה כעת כאומה, להישאר מאוחדים.
אנחנו נצמח מחדש. ככה זה, ככה צריכים לראות את החיים.
French President Emmanuel Macron said on October,
Senegalese for resident fire that we're looking. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and this is I-24 News. Thank you for sticking with us. Well, over 60,000 Israelis still remain displaced from their homes in northern Israel as fighting rages on against Hezbollah. For months on end, many were begging the government to finally take action and hit back at the Lebanese terror group, which has been firing over 9,000 rockets into the north of Israel since October 8th. But since that happened, the rocket fire has only increased. I'd like to turn to our guests in the studio. We have Shiri Fine-Grossman with us, former head of regional affairs in the Israel National Security Council, and our correspondent, Nicole Tzedek. All right, so, you know, Nicole, you have been covering the North very heavily within the course of, I mean, really since the beginning of the war, but very much over the course of the last 2 weeks. You've been speaking to locals on the ground. What is the sentiment right now? Are we seeing perhaps more people returning to the north following the IDF's decision to launch a ground invasion? Are people feeling good about the fact that we're seeing an escalation in fighting here, or perhaps even more worried?
A lot of the residents in the north that I have spoken to are grateful that something is finally being done and that Israel is taking action, because up until the past several weeks, they had no glimmer of hope as to when they might be able to return home. And over the past several weeks, that glimmer of hope has returned to them. And they say, okay, there could be an end in sight. But what we hear also from many of the residents is a mixed bag, because right now, Israel's stated war goals are still very limited. They're going in with these limited operations to dismantle the Hezbollah infrastructure that is right there on the border, that has been terrorizing these citizens of the border for years at this point. We hear stories of people going to hang their clothes up in houses near Metula, and on the clotheslines they'll see little red sniper dots, just as Hezbollah is messing with them as a joke. This is the reality that these residents in northern Israel had lived with for years. And now that it could be changing, they don't want to see them just pushed back. They want to see them and make sure that that threat is no longer there. And they want to make sure that they're pushed back across the Litani River, not just that the Hezbollah infrastructure right along the border is dismantled. And so for many of the residents, they're hoping that this is just the beginning and that Israel will continue to push forward and make it so that it's a safe place and not just the reality that they've been living in for the 20 years since 2006.
Right. So that brings me to you, Shiri. I'm interested to kind of hear your take on this. Is there really any scenario in which those who are residents of northern Israel can ever feel truly safe, given the fact that we know that Hezbollah does not adhere to diplomatic measures? It has not, listened to Resolution 1701 since 2006, as Nicole mentioned. I mean, what truly needs to happen here for these residents to feel that they can safely return home?
Well, I think something very important and historic happened a few weeks ago. It started with the Beeper attack. that was very sophisticated. I think in the Middle East, people started to question this absolute premise that Hezbollah is undefeatable, and the whole resistance axis is here to stay. We've taken back Hamas from organized military group to a guerrilla fighting situation. It doesn't have 100% safety, doesn't have 100% security, but it's a much better outcome than we've seen. There has been almost no rocket attacks on the north of Israel in the last few weeks and months. And this is the kind of the situation we want to reach in the north. Now, of course, it could be better if we have allies and colleagues joining this struggle with us. But first, they have to believe. They have to say to themselves, Israel has showed that we can have a different future. Lebanon is an amazing place. It's really not an enemy of Israel. You know, I've seen a lot of fake news by Iran trying to tell the people of Lebanon and the region that we want to resettle in south of Lebanon with new Jewish settlements. Some crazy things that for us, we look at it as pondering, but for them, this is the Zionist state wanting to control more territory. And this is exactly it. We need more allies to stand with us and believe this is possible. It's possible to bring back security to us and to our neighbors.
All right. Well, even though tensions are boiling over on Israel's northern border amid rocket fire, which has drastically increased from Hezbollah, some residents of northern communities are still refusing to evacuate. And our correspondent Robert Swift spoke with some of them and filed this report.
For nearly 12 months straight, Kiryat Shmona has been a ghost town. Its streets all but abandoned, except for the most resilient of its residents. Of the stubborn few that remain, not all are native-born, Hebrew-speaking Israelis.
Well, hi, I'm Chris. I'm a Scottish atheist here in Kiryat Shmona in the north of Israel.
Originally from Edinburgh, Chris escaped a rough upbringing and has called Israel home for 20 years. He moved to the country's north after he met an Israeli woman, and he stays when others have left to remain close to his ex-wife and their 2 children.
And it's what they want. They want us to run. And I think there's something about my childhood that no more running. You have to stand up when you're getting bullied, when you're getting pushed down. Whether it's an oppressor, whether it's terrorism, you have to stand up to that. You can't run.
Of the communities evacuated along the Lebanese border, Kiryat Shmona is the largest. 90% of its population are gone, fleeing the rockets launched at the city almost daily. But Chris, like around 1,000 other residents, refuses to run. As the war has lengthened, the scale of the bombardments against Kiryat Shmona have increased, causing residents who stayed for 10 months to give up and leave in recent weeks, Chris says.
I mean, at the beginning of the war, it was 8 or 9 missiles a day, maybe 4 or 5. But now it's 40, 50, 60.
With his living room window looking out directly onto the border and his apartment on the 4th floor, Chris's options during incoming fire are limited.
So I'll grab my helmet. I throw it on because we only have maybe 4 to 5 seconds before it hits us here. So I'll run into here. I'll pull this sliding door back. And what I do is I pull the fridge door open and I'll hide behind the fridge door.
During the worst bouts of fire, Chris and his 2 remaining neighbours have spent nights sleeping in the bomb shelter in their building's basement. For good reason. The street in front of his home is pockmarked from rocket strikes.
At least in this 500-meter radius, at least 30 have landed. So as you can see, even on the other side of the street, everything is all boarded up, destroyed. You'll see where a Farkan missile landed, which is one of the bigger Hezbollah missiles supplied by Iran. And what you can see here is basically the remains of the wee Honda. It's gone.
This was your car?
Aye, gone.
Other homes in the city have sustained much greater damage. Just over my right shoulder, this is a location where one of these rockets impacted. You can see the trees around. You can see the brown dots where the trees have been shredded from the shrapnel of that explosion, and the fencing and the pavement are just destroyed. But most of the significant damage is actually over here on this side, where this house to the left of us has been completely shredded by the shrapnel that was thrown out by that impact. And even more significantly, you'll see these two cars that have been destroyed. Now, the first of these cars, this one here, completely burnt out. You can see the fence along behind it where the burn damage is, as well as the trees around it are completely scorched. The second car, this one here, this damage here is actually, it looks like melt damage because of the intensity of the inferno from the first car. But you'll also notice that the front of the car is completely shredded with shrapnel that was thrown out from the original explosion. At the back here, you'll also see the second house where the windows have been boarded up, again, where they've been shredded from the shrapnel. But this tree here, I think, is the most demonstrative of the explosion. The top of the tree has just been completely decapitated, and it's been knocked off, presumably from the force of the explosion that went off on the other side of the street.
Smaller communities along the Israel-Lebanon border have fared no better than Kiryat Shmona. We travel south to Malkia, a kibbutz directly on the border, to visit Chris's friend. Minutes before, sirens sounded in the kibbutz.
Hey buddy, how you doing? I know it was crazy. We watched it coming over from Kiryat Shmona just now.
We take back roads, avoiding the main approach to Malkia, which is designated as red, meaning off limits to travel due to Hezbollah attacks. The forests and agricultural land in the hills approaching the kibbutz are scorched from months of cross-border barrages, with the carcasses of cattle lying in the fields where the animals fell. In Malkia we meet Dean, another Brit who has made the north of Israel his home. After marrying an Israeli and living in London many years, the open hills of northern Israel became a home for him, his wife and children. Dean is one of the few left living in the kibbutz.
When the war started, my wife and daughter evacuated. We took them to a safe place. I stayed because I was a volunteer working for the kibbutz, helping with the security, helping with the fires. And I said, there's no way you're taking me away from here when the kibbutz needs the help.
Malkia is so vulnerable to attacks from Lebanon that firefighters are not permitted to attend the kibbutz, meaning the handful of volunteers like Dean are left to tackle fires that occur using improvised equipment.
What am I doing caught up in this fight? It's like any expat caught up in a fight in any country around the world. This just happens to be my home now. It has been for 8 years, and I'm here, and I will remain here, and I will protect my town, my village, my kibbutz, and the country. This is my home, and why would I run back to England?
While travelling around the kibbutz, Dean keeps his flak vest and a weapon close to hand.
You don't have a gun license?
No, because I don't speak Hebrew.
Like many northern communities, Malkia is close enough to the border that you could shout to Lebanese villagers on the other side.
That's Lebanon.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason we haven't hit that is because that belongs to the Lebanese army and not Hezbollah. That was built by the Israelis when we were last in Lebanon. I'm going to park here for a quick escape, okay? The viewpoint, this was built 2 years ago. Tourists to come, because we have the hotel here, picnic area, just enjoy the view. You know, because we're not at war with the farmers. You know, we wave at the farmers every day, you know, hi, how are you doing? You know, now most of the buildings have been taken out because the Hezbollah have used them for firing.
How much civilian activity do you see on that side? Are there still people living there?
No, all the farmers are gone. Everyone is gone.
As the conflict on the border flares up to new heights, yet more people, Israelis and Lebanese, are being displaced. For their parts, Chris and Dean intend to stay, no matter where the spiralling violence leads.
There's probably less than 1,000 people left in Kiryat Shmona and the entire surrounding area. But if we all leave, they're going to win.
If everyone decided they're all going to evacuate, then there's no one left to protect our kibbutz. So we stayed.
Well, joining us now is a displaced resident of Kibbutz Agoshrim, Gilat Roda. Gilat, how are you feeling now that we're seeing the IDF take major action against Hezbollah?
Oh, hello, good evening.
I think it makes me feel like there is a hope after 11 months being out of my house, of my home, of my friends and school and my kids' friends. Now I think that the government put the North ahead, and it gives me hopes. I hope it's gonna end soon, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, in past wars, even after Israel has pushed Hezbollah back from the border and then signed ceasefire deals, you know, ensuring that the terror group wouldn't come back to the Israeli border, that hasn't really worked. Do you think that you can ever truly feel safe living on the border of Lebanon, and do you plan on going back home?
Wow, this is a very hard question that you're asking, because I'm not sure. I don't think that I will be safe or feel safe like 100%. No, the answer is not. If I'm coming back, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm too scared, and I have 2 kids that I need to take care of. So now my answer is I'm not sure. I hope so. I want to go back home. I miss home, but it's too dangerous for us now.
Yeah, I can understand that completely. You know, at this point, what do you want to see Israel do to keep the citizens of northern Israel safe?
I think they need to do what they're doing now, like the last few weeks, 2 weeks. I think they need to be more honest and tell us, the civilians, what they find, if there are any towels, if there are any, I don't know, things that we need to know. Because I don't think that we really know everything. You know what I mean? So we will feel safe. And I think they need, I live in the kibbutz, and I think they need to, like the 17th, when they have weapons and we have soldiers, and kibbutz was a safe place to be. I think we, unfortunately, need to go back to those times.
Right.
Because even if I go to the kibbutz now, I don't think that there is enough people there that can take care of the kibbutz or protect the kibbutz. We have few, but it's not enough if something big happened like at Gaza.
All right, Gilat, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and you know, hearing your personal story. Stay strong. Hopefully you're going to be back home soon enough.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn back to our guests in the studio. You know, given the severe damage that Hezbollah is facing from Israel at this point, couldn't this be a major moment for Israel's allies to rally behind the Lebanese government, for example, and to help release the Lebanese public essentially from the clutches of Hezbollah's political and military strength in the country? Or does the Lebanese public not want international involvement here at all?
Look, to call Lebanon a state will be kind of not disclosing the full truth. It's not functioning. Ever since the bombing that went on on August 2018 or 19, sorry if I'm not completely accurate, in the port of Lebanon, it took a real blow to the country. That, along with sanctions on Hezbollah, who really put his grip on the central bank, on all the financial institutions, really made it impossible. The institutions and the politics of Lebanon is at its weakest point. Millions, or let's say thousands of Christian Lebanese have left, Druze, people who want freedom and liberalism, and it used to be, you know, the financial, it was the Dubai of the Middle East, okay? What's Dubai today, what was Beirut in the past, with a lot of freedoms that were practiced there. It could become that again. It will take a village, you know, it will take a lot of the Sunni allies, like you said, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to really put its prestige, money, energy. And I think, you know, when I was in the National Security Council, we used to talk about it a lot, and we saw kind of this despair out of the Sunni allies of what can become of Lebanon. And I think, with the right leadership, and this is what we need here, global leadership, not telling, like Macron, telling us, oh, let's take away the arms. No, let's go together against evil. It's possible to take them down. It's possible to create a different future for the Middle East. And it starts with leaning in on this one.
Well, we're going to turn back to Tel Aviv right now, where smaller scale protests are underway in the city after the main demonstration was canceled tonight to call for a ceasefire and hostage release deal amid concerns over escalations with Iran and Hezbollah. This is, of course, happening as 101 hostages remain in Gaza for nearly a year now, and our correspondent Joe Brown is joining us from Tel Aviv with the latest updates here. Joe, what is the latest on the ground?
Well, every Saturday, more or less, for the last 18 months or so, this area right here, Begin Gate, opposite the IDF headquarters and very close to Hostages Square, has been the home of mass protests, starting from the judicial reforms up until right now, where every week there is protests about the hostages and to get a hostage deal. The Hostages and Families Forum have said that the Tel Aviv protest for tonight, for them, is cancelled. However, there is another group, another organisation, Kulanu Hatufim, and they will be rallying here, but in much smaller numbers. The reason why the Hostages Forum decided to cancel theirs is because of the Homefront commands. At the moment, and it has been this since the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Tuesday, throughout the centre of Israel, you're only allowed a maximum of 1,000 people at a gathering. The Kulanu Hatufim organisation, which is a lot more political, they have said that they will continue a protest. There's actually been a couple of people just over my shoulder who, a couple of minutes ago, they were rallying. There were some hostage family members, and all of them were saying roughly the same thing. Netanyahu has abandoned the hostages. He's only focused around what's happening in northern Israel and what's happening with Iran, that there are still 101 hostages in Gaza, and especially with it coming to the one-year anniversary of October the 7th, they're still worried. So there will be some protests here, however, they will be on a much smaller scale. And that's actually much more beneficial because although we've been talking a lot about the strikes in Beirut and Dahia, they are in very densely populated areas because that's where Hezbollah has its headquarters. The IDF headquarters is also in a very densely populated area. On this street is the largest building in Israel, the Azrieli Sarona building. There's also a couple more in the top 10. So if there was going to be an attack, the Kiryat right behind me, that would be a target. So the fact that they are minimizing the numbers does reduce the possibility of potential casualties if there is an attack. At the moment, there is no sign that there will be, but the Homefront command rules stay in place. No more than 1,000 people are allowed to congregate in the center of Israel at one time.
All right, that's Joe Brown joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you for the latest regarding the ongoing protests for a hostage release and ceasefire deal. Now, it is hard to believe, but almost a year later, 101 Israeli hostages still remain in Hamas captivity in the Gaza Strip, 97 of whom were abducted by Hamas on October 7th. Well, 83-year-old Oded Lifshitz is one of those hostages. He was brutally kidnapped from Kibbutz Nir Oz with his 85-year-old wife, Yocheved Lifshitz. Well, she was freed from captivity just days into the war. Oded is still being held captive by Hamas 365 days later. He's a peace activist who regularly transported patients from Gaza to receive medical treatment in hospitals across Israel. He's an advocate for human rights and a lifelong journalist as well. And joining us now is his grandson, Daniel Lifshitz. Daniel, I think really just to begin here, what information do you have, if anything, about your grandfather's condition at this point?
Hi. Good evening, Shana Tova. If we can say that, let's hope really that Shana Tova will come on us and we'll see everybody back home and can be celebrated with them. I want to say first thing that my grandfather was a big advocate, not only for human rights, for education, He was advocating that Gaza needs education. He tried to convince both governments, both parties, that the most important thing in Gaza is education. Otherwise, very bad thing will happen. And he was right, and a very big thing happened because education was not a part of what the Israeli governments have tried to implement in Gaza since the 80s. About him personally, what we know is that it was a roller coaster for us. My grandmother, when she was kidnapped, she thought he was murdered because he was shot in the hand. He was dragged naked at home to his backyard of his amazing cactus garden that you can almost see it behind one of those pictures. And he was laying down on the ground, unconscious and bleeding because he had blood pressure issues. But after the first release, so Ada Sagi, she said that when she was kidnapped and they took her in Gaza into a storage of vegetables and fruits in Khan Yunis, she saw him on the table, bleeding, but with a white galabia, and he was awake. And he told them actually even that, here, Ada, she speaks much better Arabic than me. You can speak with her. And Ada said that they told her that they are going to take him to the hospital to take the bullet out of his hand. And after a few days, she asked, what about him? So they told her that they are going to put him in an apartment and not down in the tunnels. And then another hostage that came back told us suddenly that she was with him there for 30 days. When he lost conscious and then he fainted, they took him. And when they took him, she was handicapped. So she told their captives, I can't stay alone. So they moved her. And because they moved her, we don't know if he came back there. So we have no really information about.
Danielle, do we still have you? All right, looks like we lost Danielle's connection. Unfortunately, it seems like we're having a bit of a Danielle, you're back with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
All right, it's okay. So basically you were saying that you guys lost contact with him at that point, correct?
Yeah, at that point that she doesn't know. After 30 days, he fainted in captivity, and we have no information about him since then because the other hostage being with him, she moved to another place.
Now, unfortunately, we're going out for a commercial break in just about 2 minutes. At this point, negotiations for a hostage release deal seem to be at a standstill as the fighting with Hezbollah escalates. How does your family feel about the fighting with Lebanon and how it's going to impact the hostages? And what message do you want to send to the public about what should happen right now?
Look, I think the war in Lebanon is, you have to do what you have to do there. Nasrallah being assassinated and the situation in the north is awful and people have to go back home. We have to try from one side to gather it together. That will be a deal that is combining the north and Gaza. But from the other side, trying to get into the hostage deal without a connection to Lebanon. Otherwise, we will be stuck, and we are stuck, and all the countries in the world are stuck. The negotiations table is doing a very bad work, really, really bad, awful almost. I think they have to continue to negotiate around the hostages without the connection to Lebanon to get a deal, even if it's a small deal, any kind of a deal, 10 days of ceasefire in Lebanon and in the south, many kind of things. It's possible. There are women there, old people there. My grandfather is a great-grandfather, a year there. You can't take him out. I mean, what's going on? He's an old man. It's the most holy to the Quran. Let's kill the image of Hamas and bring him home.
You're absolutely right. And, we're praying for your family. We're praying for your grandfather. Thank you so much for joining us and sending your message. We're unfortunately going to have to end the show for now. I'm Natasha Kirchuk. This is I-24 News. Thank you to our guests. We'll see you tomorrow.
Our beloved region was 95% heaven before that fateful day. Then, in one piercing moment, horror and darkness took over our lives. But Jewish National Fund, USA, were here with us from day one, helping us to collect our pieces together. We choose life and we will continue, always, to choose life together.
Sale for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad, with renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayazad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
יש לנו משימה כעת כאומה, להישאר מאוחדים.
אנחנו נצמח מחדש. ככה זה. ככה צריכים לראות את החיים.
French President Emmanuel Macron said on October
Senegalese for fire.
צופינו שומרי השבת שמצטרפים אלינו כעת, אנחנו עם החדשות והעדכונים במהלך החג הזה. לא מעט אזעקות וירי נשמעו לעבר יישובי הצפון. צה"ל התיר לפרסום את שמותיהם של לוחמי צה"ל שנפלו בקרבות על הגנת המדינה. סרן בן ציון פלח, בן 21, מניצני עוז, קצין לוחם בגדוד 202 בחטיבת הצנחנים, נפל ביום רביעי בקרב בדרום לבנון. סמל דניאל אביב חיים, סופר, בן 19 מאשקלון, חניך במסלול יהודי לקצונת קשרי גדודים, בגדוד 13 בחטיבת גולני, נפל בלחימה בצפון. רבת טל דרור, בן 19 מירושלים, משק תקשוב בגדוד 13 בחטיבת גולני, נפל גם הוא בלחימה בצפון. נאמר עד כה נהרגו 9 לוחמי צה"ל בתמרון הקרקעי בלבנון. דורון קדוש, כתב הצבאי של גלי צה"ל. כן. לטובת צופי השומרי שבת, עשה לנו סדר, מה אירע כאן בחג ובשבת.
אז נתחיל באמת מלבנון, שם נמשך התמרון הקרקעי, 2 אוגדות שפועלות בשטח, 98 ו-36, מצאו הרבה אמצעי לחימה וחיסלו עד עכשיו יותר מ-400 מחבלי חיזבאללה. במהלך החג הותר לפרסום שמו של סרן בן ציון פלח, הוא נהרג בהיתקלות עם מחבלים, וכמו שאמרת נדב, 9 חללים של צה"ל עד כה בתמרון הקרקעי בדרום לבנון. במהלך החג ישראל ניסתה לחסל את מחליפו המיועד של נסראללה, השם ספי א-דין, בתקיפה ברובע הדחיה בביירות. גוברת הערכה שהוא אכן חוסל, אבל עדיין אין לכך אישור רשמי מישראל, וגם גלי תקיפות רכבים במהלך כל החג והשבת על רובע הדחיה בביירות ועל מוקדים רבים נוספים בלבנון. לגבי איראן, ישראל נערכת לתקיפה משמעותית באיראן ומאותתת היום, אנחנו נערכים לעשות את זה וזה יקרה בקרוב, זה יהיה רציני ומשמעותי. הערב נוחת כאן בישראל מפקד פיקוד המרכז של צבא ארצות הברית, הגנרל קורילה. 2 החללים שהותר שמם לפרסום מרמת הגולן הם 2 חיילי גדוד 13 של גולני, נהרגו מכתבם ששיגרו המיליציות השיעיות בעיראק. הכתבם הזה שוגר לשטחה של ישראל, לא התגלה על ידי מערכות הגילוי ולכן גם לא הופעלה התראה. המקרה המזעזע הזה אומר שהחיילים נהרגו במיטותיהם מבלי שהם יודעים שיש כתבם שעושה את דרכו אל אותו מוצב צבאי. 2 נהרגו, 24 נוספים נפצעו בתקרית הזו. ביהודה ושומרון, תקיפה אווירית חריגה של מטוס קרב על מחנה הפליטים טול כרם, חוסלו שם לפחות 14 מחבלים שתכננו לבצע פיגוע תופת משמעותי ביותר ביום הציון של שנה ל7 באוקטובר. ולגבי עזה, במהלך החג והשבת ישראל אישרה שחוסל לפני 3 חודשים ראוחי מושטהא, ראש שלטון חמאס ברצועת עזה. זו תקיפה שאומנם הייתה לפני כמה חודשים, אבל במהלך החג הגיע המודיעין הוודאי שהוא אכן חוסל, וגם סיפור יוצא דופן שנחשף במהלך החג על הצעירה היזידית שהוחזקה בעשור האחרון ברצועת עזה על ידי מחבל של חמאס דאעש, ושוחררה על ידי ישראל למשפחתה בעיראק.
כן, נאמר שיש אזעקות כעת. זה קרה גם במהלך החג, כפי שיכולתם לשמוע, באזורים נרחבים ברחבי הצפון, קו קיסריה, צפונה. כאמור, אזעקות כרגע בקצרין. דורון, בוא נדבר על האירוע בגולן. אירוע קשה מאוד, כפי שאתה מתאר. 2 חיילים, 2 לוחמים נהרגו, 24 נפצעו.
כן.
אירוע קשה שצה"ל, אני מניח, מתחקר אותו, מדוע לא הופעלו האזעקות שם באזור. אבל אתה יודע, אנחנו מדברים פה על 8 זירות, על כל הזירות. מה קורה עם המיליציות השיעיות בעיראק? כן.
זה בדיוק העניין.
האם צה"ל מגיב להם? יש יחס, מקבלות את היחס הזה, שאנחנו רק מקבלים את הכתבה מהם ונותנים להם בבקשה להיכנס לשמי הארץ?
זה בדיוק המצב, בזמן שישראל עסוקה באופן התקפי בלבנון, ברצועת עזה, גם את החות'ים בתימן תוקפים מעת לעת, זה קרה כבר פעמיים עד עכשיו. מול המיליציות השיעיות בעיראק אין שום פעולה התקפית של מדינת ישראל. ישראל מגנה, מתגוננת מפני מה שמגיע לכאן ולא תוקפת. צריך להגיד שיש מורכבויות בלתקוף את המיליציות שם. זה אזור שיש בו בסיסים אמריקאים, ארצות הברית שולטת בכל המרחב האווירי של עיראק. יכול להיות שאולי העובדה שישראל לא תקפה בעיראק זה כי יש על זה איזשהו וטו אמריקני. אבל היה ברור לחלוטין שכמו שהחות'ים בתימן ירו וירו לכאן עשרות שיגורים, ורק שהם הרגו אזרח ישראלי בלב תל אביב, זה הוביל את ישראל בסופו של דבר ללכת ולתקוף שם. גם כאן, ישראל שנה שלמה ספגה וספגה, חיכתה וחיכתה, והיה ברור לחלוטין שרק שיקרה משהו, רק שהתוצאות יהיו הרסניות, ובמקרה הזה 2 חיילים הרוגים ו24 פצועים, נדמה לי שהערב הזה ברור שישראל לא יכולה להמשיך להימנע מלתקוף.
אז דוקטור קובי ברדה, האמריקאים, הם מטפלים בזירה הזו, בזירה השיעית-עיראקית, במיליציות שמה?
אנחנו ראינו את ארצות הברית מתואמת איתנו רק בשבוע האחרון עם ההתקפה, אגב גם כוחות נוספים, ובעצם שאלת השאלות שמעניינת את כולנו, איפה אנחנו הולכים לקראת הסיפור עם איראן. הערכה שלי שבסופו של דבר ההתקפה תצא בברכה אמריקאית, למרות שראינו בסוף השבוע את ביידן מספר שזה יכול להיות לא רעיון כל כך טוב לתקוף את מתקני הנפט, שזה הפך להיות השיח המרכזי. התקפה בעצם על המנוע העיקרי של הכסף שמחזיק את הממשל האיראני, וגם ראינו התייחסות מאוד מעניינת בסוף השבוע של דונלד טראמפ, שבעצם מכפיל על האמרה שלו מלפני שבועיים, שתוך 2 ישראל לא תהיה. הוא אומר שאיראן שלא היססה לראות פעמיים טילים קונבנציונליים, אכן תירה טיל גרעיני ותביא להשמדה של ישראל אם לא יתבצע מהלך התקפי כדי לחסל את האיום הזה. אז זו הזירה האמריקאית כלפי המעורבות שלנו בסוף שבוע.
מה האמריקאים מייעצים לישראל בשיחות התיאום לעשות, והאם גם הם מתכוונים לשתף פעולה אקטיבית נגד איראן?
תראה, בניגוד לחלק מה שיושבים פה בפאנל, אני לא יושב במרכזי קבלת ההחלטות, זה בעיקר עולמות תוכן של חלקים בפאזל ונסות לחבר אותם. אני חושב שאנחנו יורדים לעומק של הרבה מאוד דברים. למשל, ביום חמישי אופק מתכנסת בדחיפות. אופק זה בעצם מי שמארגן או מאסדר את הנושא של הנפט. שר האנרגיה הסעודי בהצהרה בעיניי יוצא דופן, אומר, אנחנו יותר קרובים $50 חבית מאשר $100 חבית, היום סדר גודל של $70 חבית, כאשר הדיבורים, אם בתרחיש של התקפה, נגיע עד $200 חבית, חודש לפני הבחירות. אני חושב שיש פה איזשהו רמז שנשתל, על איזשהו תיאום משולש של ארצות הברית, סעודיה וישראל בתרחיש שכזה, שוב, מבלי שאני יושב לא במרכזי קבלת החלטות ולא בשום דבר, אלא פשוט common sense ולקרוא את המפה ואת הציור של מה שמניחים לפנינו, ולכן אני בכלל לא אתפלא אם ב7 לאוקטובר, כי במזרח התיכון יודעים לכבד מאוד סמליות של תאריכים, אני גם לא אתפלא אם זה בשעה 6:32 בבוקר שהמטוס הראשון יפיל את הפצצה הראשונה שלו, אנחנו נצפה במה שישראל מכינה לאיראן כדי להחזיר לה. תוך כדי סגירה מאחורה של ארצות הברית, וייתכן גם של סעודיה, כאמור כפי שיצא בסוף ישיבת אופק מפי שר האנרגיה הסעודי.
כן, חנן, רצית להוסיף מילה בעניין הזה.
יש כאן התלכדות זירות, אבל בתחום אחר לגמרי, ונוגע לנושא הזה של מעורבות של ברית אברהם. כי גם ארצות הברית וגם ישראל יש אינטרס אחד ברור להחליש מאוד את איראן. כל ברית אברהם, כל ההסכמים של ברית אברהם, הייעוד העיקרי שלהם היה ליצור חזית, האמריקאים, על ידי האמריקאים, ליצור חזית שעומדת מול הציר האיראני. הסעודים, אם ישראל תיראה כמו שהיא נראתה לפני חודש, הסעודים היו מחפשים אלטרנטיבות, והם חיפשו אלטרנטיבות. קטר מצא אלטרנטיבות, האמירויות התחילו פתאום לדבר עם האיראנים. ולכן רק מצב שבו, וזה אינטרס משותף, אמריקאי-ישראלי, להביא את איראן להבנה שמה שהיה לא יהיה, זה סיפור אחר לגמרי, ואז כל הסכמי השלום יהיה להם מקום. במצב הנוכחי, לדעתי, עדיין אין להם, זה לא שייך להחלטה ישראלית בכלל.
אז רונית, לא הסכמי שלום, עוד לא, בינתיים, אבל כן אולי הסכמים לקראת חזית, קואליציה, שתטפל באיומים הללו.
תראו, אני קוראת פשוט את מה שהם אומרים, ואנחנו שומעים את מה שהם אומרים, והם מדברים מאוד ברור. שרי החוץ של ירדן, סעודיה, מצרים, בחריין, הם מדברים ברור, והם אומרים, אנחנו מוכנים כעת לעשות את הנורמליזציה עם ישראל. הם לא מחכים למשהו נוסף, הם מוכנים לזה עכשיו. עכשיו, מה המשמעות? שאנחנו צריכים לשים את הריכוז שלנו בפעולה המדינית לצד הפעולה הצבאית. אנחנו לא מקיימים פעולות צבאיות, אלא לתכליות מדיניות. ולכן אני אומרת, בוא נשים לב, שהאינסטינקט שלנו להגיד לא עכשיו, אבל הם לא איתנו, כל הדחיות האלה שבאות מאיתנו, אני לא מבינה למה. למה לא ישראל תגיד עכשיו, אני יוצאת לפעולה הגנתית מול איראן, אבל באותה עת אני קוראת לכל מדינות האזור להיפגש איתנו עכשיו, כולל הפלסטינים והלבנונים וכולל כולם, כדי לכונן משטרים יציבים שיוכלו לעמוד נגד הציר האיראני.
שלום, למה אתה כל כך רציני?
זה לא העבר.
לאור הדברים שרונית אומרת.
פשוט, אמיתי, אני לא כזה שף מעולל, אבל אני יודע שתבשיל, שגם אם בישלת אותו 3 שעות והורדת אותו רבע שעה אפילו מהגז קצת קודם, אז הוא לא בלתי אכיל והוא בעייתי. הדברים צריכים להבשיל.
גם רבע שעה מאוחר מדי.
רונית, הדברים צריכים להבשיל. אני לא רואה הבשלה מדינית בשום זירה.
אז אני לא סומכת על אלה שיודעים יותר טוב מאיתנו, כי יש להם ניסיון צבאי בשב"כ, במוסד ובכוחות הביטחון. לא סומכת.
אני לא הייתי מתנסה לרגע, חלילה, רונית.
אני קוראת לישראלים לשאול, האם נתניהו
אני יכול להגיד באותה מידה על אנשי אקדמיה.
בוא ניתן לשלום להשלים את המשפט. שלום, בבקשה.
זה לא דיון בין אסכולות.
אתה לא רוצה רבע שעה לפני ולא רבע שעה אחרי. השאלה היא איפה הסיכון יותר גדול.
אני חושב...
בוא נשמע את שלום, בבקשה.
עיני ערך 1701, הסכם הגז בדקה ה-90 לפני בחירות, כשראש הממשלה היה לפיד וחתם אותו בלחץ עם האקדח המעשן של חיזבאללה, ועוד כאלה הסכמים שנחתמו וישראל רצה אליהם לא, כשהשעה עדיין לא כשרה, וכשעדיין לא בשלו התנאים, ולכן הסכמים צריך לחתום ולקיים כשהתנאים בשלים, וכשישראל ידעה על העליונה בלבנון מול לבנון, מול חיזבאללה, וכרגע יש בידע את המנופים, מי שצריך, שנייה, תני לי לסיים, צריכים לפנות לישראל. אי אפשר שישראל תמיד תהיה הפונה המבקשת.
והשאלה, חברים, איתן, והשאלה הגדולה,
בוא נקרא את זה בפנן שאתה